Hi. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Thank you all for coming out this evening. And because we're going to have a packed lineup, I'm going to get straight into things. So today I'm going to be sharing with all of you some of my favorite things about the Firefox DevTools and how they've helped me better understand some of the more powerful new CSS features and layout techniques. So today we're going to be covering what I consider to be the three cornerstones of modern CSS layouts, which is Flexbox, Grid, and the box alignment properties. So I want to start with the first thing, Flexbox. The layout model, which I feel that it's the layout model where nobody knows the size of anything. So right now, Firefox is the only browser with a Flexbox inspector, like Ali mentioned earlier. And we can locate this in this Layouts tab. And you can toggle it with this nice little toggle here. Or you can choose to click on this tag thing in the inspector. So what this does is that it shows you the outline of each of your Flex items. And if there's any free space available, it's going to be this textured thing here. It also tells you other things. So I hope this is big enough. It tells you your Flex direction. For right now, it's row, and the wrap status, which is no wrap. But the most important thing about Flexbox Inspector is it actually tells you what the browser does when it grows or shrinks your items. And I'm going to go into detail a bit later. So the specification sort of recommends that we use the keyword properties of on your Flex items because they correctly reset the other three properties which the shorthand actually covers, which is Flex Grow, Flex Shrink, and Flex Basis. The sizing of Flex items does depend on a number of factors. So we've got things like the amount of free space available. We've got the amount of content within your Flex item. And we've also got the starting width of your Flex item. And the exact algorithm that calculates the Flex item size is kind of complicated, but it is outlined in the specification if you're really curious to find out how that goes. It's kind of a long section, so I'm not going to talk about it. But I feel that the key to figuring out Flexbox is understanding what the Flex Basis property actually does. So, for example, if I put a fixed value of 100 pixels as a Flex Basis, I think intuitively a lot of developers would think, OK, I'm probably going to get a box that is of a size of 100 pixels, because we are very used to having absolute control over our sizing instructions. But Flex Basis behaves a bit differently in that it's the starting point of which the size of your box is calculated. So the key here is it's the starting point. Because if your Flex items are allowed to grow or shrink, odds are the final size is not going to be 100 pixels. So there's just something to keep in mind. So I'm using a very simplified example to illustrate this point. So here under Flexbox Basics, we have two Flex containers. I'm going to highlight them. So two Flex containers, they have the same properties on them in that only the parent has display Flex on it. Each of the children have nothing set on it. So it's a very simple example. You just put display Flex on a container, all its children become Flex items. So these Flex children have a default value, which is it has a Flex grow factor of 0, shrink factor of 1, and a basis of auto. So what this means is that items are not going to grow beyond their starting width. So even if I have a lot of space, it's not going to grow because the Flex grow factor is 0. So no growth. But the moment there isn't enough space, it's going to all three items, if they can, they're going to start shrinking at the same rate. So the reason why, if you see, when I started out, it was something like this. The reason why, even though the amount of the content within the second columns is exactly the same, just as this is a sentence, but they behave differently because for the second container, the size of this is a sentence is impacted by its sibling, who has a lot of space. This sibling is causing the shrink to kick in much earlier because at about this point, there's no more room. So everybody is supposed to start to shrink at this point. But your first container still has lots of room. So like, nah, I'm not going to shrink. And the browser doesn't break words. So Word is stuck. Word can't go anywhere. It's just going, yeah. So that's the reason why, even though you have exactly the same content, and if you have two separate Flex items, they may or may not be the same size. And this is the reason for that. Another thing that I want to highlight that I think is very important to understand is the difference between a Flex basis value of auto and a Flex basis value of 0. So I'm going to bring your attention to the next example where both of these Flex containers have exactly the same content. So none of this funny things happening above. And again, so these items are now set to be able to both grow and shrink. So I'm going to highlight this. If you look, I've now set the Flex grow factor of the first item to 1. The second has a growth factor of 2, and the last one has a growth factor of 0. And what's going to happen here is that the first set has Flex basis set to auto, but the second set has Flex basis set to 0. And the difference between the two is more evident. This is when the Flexbox inspector comes in really handy, because it tells you what's happening for the sizing. So I'm going to pull this a bit larger so there's more growth, and you can see the inspector responds in real time, which is great. So when you set the Flex basis to auto, content size is taken into account in the starting width, and the browser tells you that. It tells you that, OK, this is the starting content size of give me 1 unit of free space, full stop. So that's about like 246. Then it has grown. It has grown because I've set a Flex grow factor, and there's a lot of space. So all the extra space has been allocated. And if you look at the space here, it says it's about 68. For the second item, it's about 136. So the amount of free space that has been distributed is in accordance to the Flex grow factor. But it's not the absolute size. So if you look at the final size, which the browser does tell you what the final size is, I'm going back to the first one. It's about 314. And the second one is about 394. So the size of the second item is not double of the first one. It is that the free space that is given to it is double of the first one. That's when you set the Flex basis to auto. Now, in the event that you do want your Flex item, you want one of them to be exactly double of the other one, that's when you use a Flex basis of 0. And the difference here is that when you set the Flex basis to 0, the browser ignores the content size. And again, the Flexbox inspector is going to show you this. So with a Flex basis of 0, content size is 0. So any available free space is immediately is used for distribution. So the total amount of free space available in the second container is actually the total width of the container. You have to minus off this bit, which kind of behaves like in the first example above the word. That's the minimum content. The browser can't take away any more space from the last column because, again, browsers by default are not going to break words. So it's going to, whatever minimum content width is here, it's going to minus off that, and that is considered free space. So that free space is going to be allocated to the two previous items in the ratio of 1 to 2 because I set the grow factor as 1 and 2 respectively. So if we inspect the size, it has grown about 311 pixels, and the final size is 311 pixels. And if you look at the second one, it's about 622. So it's exactly double. So if that's the effect that you're looking for, then you'd want to set your Flex basis to 0. And that's the key difference, I think, when a lot of times, because Flex basis of auto is the initial value that the browsers set on your Flex items if you don't do anything to it. So if you just set a Flex grow factor of like units, and then a lot of people get confused because they're like, hey, I set Flex grow factor of 1 on item A and a Flex grow factor of 3 on item B, but it's not 3 times of that size. That's pretty much the reason why. Another useful feature of Flexbox I think a lot of people utilize is the ability to use box alignment properties. Because it used to be that it was really hard to align things in a vertical axis. With box alignment, it's a lot easier. And so what the Flexbox inspector can show you is it shows you what happens with the available space when you trigger it, because there's this different texture and everything. So box alignment properties were actually meant to be used across all the layout models. For now, it's only supported for Flex and Grid. But I think I'm not going to be ambitious here. I'm going to say in the far future, you could potentially be able to use these box alignment properties on the older layout models, like in like display block as well. So fingers crossed that happens. I don't know, before my grandchildren are born or something. Never mind. Moving on. So when we use the different box alignment properties, we have options. So the first option I'm going to talk about is called justify content. So there are a lot of values, as you can see. The good thing about DevTools is that if you can't remember any keywords, there's autocomplete, and it can show you everything that's available. So they are like categories of these alignment properties. So the first one I'm going to cover are the so-called positional ones of like start, center, and end. So these are fairly straightforward in that they kind of shift all your flex items along the main axis. So the main axis is the direction which the flex items are laid out. And we also have distribution keywords, so of space around, between, and evenly. So what these do is that they allow you to disperse the space between your flex items, like different widths, depending on the result that you're looking for. For Flexbox, though, you can also change the direction of the main axis. So right now, the default is row, but I can also change it to column. And what this does is that max height. Can't spell height. Ooh, why is this so hard? Height. So what this does is that it sort of just flips the main axis to, instead of being horizontal left to right, it becomes vertical top to bottom. So your alignment properties still function similarly in that it still goes according to the main axis direction, but you've changed the main axis direction. That's why it's kind of different. So that's one way to something to remember if you're changing flex directions and you still want to align along certain axes. Together with the main axis, the other term we use for flex is cross-axis, which is the axis that is perpendicular to the main axis. I did not make this up. It's in the spec, so English. So by default, I'm going to turn these back. By default, all items are stretched along the cross-axis to the full height of the flex line. So all my items here, actually, these are not their original heights. It's that when I put a display flex on the parent, the default value for flex items is stretch along the cross-axis. But the moment I put an align items or an align self property to, say, maybe end, they revert back to their original height. So this is actually, I have a lot of flex items of different sizes, different font sizes as well. And one of the interesting values for align items is actually something called baseline. Because if you notice, I have different font sizes, and then I have different alignments within each item. So if you happen to have a design, and this is probably more art-directed sort of design, if you have like different flex items, and you actually want the text to relate to each other, maybe it's a sentence or something, right? If you have this sort of a mountainous layout, people are going to I can't read this very well. So if you do want that sort of an effect, you can put baseline to let all the baseline of all the text just line up with each other, and makes it easier to read. So that's a potential suggestion if you have a use case that's something like that. The last one that applies in Flex is align content. So sometimes you have a height of, let's make it big. So sometimes you have a container that's like way taller than the height of your flex items. So you have this like weird white space thing that you may not want. The property that you use to kind of pack everything together and maybe move them along the container is align content. So like if I do center, it packs all of it together, and then you can kind of shift it all the way to the top or all the way to the bottom. So these are the alignment properties that make it much easier to sort of arrange items within the container. So that's it for Flex. The rest of the time I'm going to have to cover is Grid, because I can't talk about modern CSS without talking about Grid. So I'm curious to find out how many people actually have used Grid. Like, you don't have to, like, great, this is a much better room than no Grid. No, off the record, cancel that. Anyways, but whether you're starting out with Grid or you're already using it in production, Firefox's Grid Inspector is still the best tool available at the moment. In fact, I think they were the only browser that sort of shipped a very strong suite of Grid DevTools the moment Grid came out, right? So the overlay can be toggled, same thing. You click on the tag, or you go to the layout panel, and I think what's nice about, I can't remember when this was supported, but you can now sort of have multiple grid overlays on the page, which is really useful if you have multiple grids on your page, or if you're using nested grids and you want to see how it looks like, how it aligns with the parent grid. This is really useful. You can also change colors if purple's not there. This is a set of default colors, so if you don't like any of them, you can change them. So I think that's pretty nice. What other things do we have? We have the option to extend lines indefinitely, which is nice when, again, you have like multiple grids, and you, especially if they're spread like top and bottom. So extending the lines infinitely is also a pretty useful feature. I'm very glad they put that in. And other options include displaying line numbers and area names, which we will also cover later. So the most basic usage of laying out things with Grid is simply to set the parent to display Grid, and then you define like, okay, I want, in this very simple example, I have 3 columns of 5ems, 2 rows of 5ems. I sort of appreciate the syntax of Grid because it's kind of visual, because I can see 3 values means 3 columns, and then 2 values means 2 rows. And this is what we have. So the browser, by default, if we look at the markup here, it's a grid container, and then I've got like 6 grid items in it. So when I set display grid, the browser automatically is going to place all these items in the grid using a very well thought out algorithm. And again, it's defined in the spec, long chunk of text if you're interested in reading it. But I mean, things being placed one after another is behavior we're all very familiar with already. What's special about Grid is how simple it is to manually place items anywhere on your grid in either dimension. So we're going to take a look at the second grid. Turn the first one off. So my favorite analogy to talk about manual placement in Grid is placing pieces on a chessboard. So that's why this example looks like this. So if you look at the mark, I have a grid with 3 items in it. So the 3 pawns are my 3 items. And the properties used to place them are grid row and grid column. So because this is a simple 3 by 3, you could probably do without line numbers. But if you happen to have a design which is more complex than this, you could have like maybe 15, 20 columns. You're not going to sit there and like 1, 2, 3. No, you're not going to do that. So you want to have a tool where you overlay and say, okay, I want my thing to be on column 13, and you see it in like, yeah, here, 13. So that's very useful, and Firefox is the only browser that has line numbers. You'd think that it's a feature that will come in like by default, but turns out it's not. So that's pretty helpful to have line numbers. I see less people using at the moment, I think this is going to pick up once more people realize, is grid area names. So third example, turn it on. So same thing, you can define columns and rows, but then you can also name them like alphanumerically. I'm not very creative, but I like to eat fruits. So we've got apple, banana, and cherry. So the syntax of how grid template areas works is that each line surrounded with a quote represents a grid row. And then every value within the line is going to make up a column. So every line must have the same number of columns. Otherwise, the whole thing is moot. But when so in the grid, in the DevTools, it's sort of like flattens it out. But in the code, what I would do is I would really align it as if the grid, as how the grid looks like. So in my code, it kind of looks like how it does on the page. And I personally find that visual comparison very useful. And what I find useful for using grid area names is if you have a design that has maybe lots of different components that you need to tweak at different breakpoints, what helps here is that you, instead of having to tweak the positions of each of your individual grid items, you do all your adjustments on the parent container itself by changing by tweaking the positions on this grid template area. So I've got an example here that's much better than apple, banana, and cherry. Is this poster, this vintage Braun hi-fi poster, which this is how it looks like on print. It's really nice on a landscape view, but it's the kind of design that if you kind of squish it, you can't keep this one anymore. You kind of have to rejig the elements on the page. So what I did is I rejigged it at about this point. So you can see that if you name the areas, Firefox Grid Inspector actually shows you what you named it. So at the widest point, I have like my titles all the way there. Then I have some text. I have a key image that takes up like two rows, and so on and so forth. But when I hit a next breakpoint, I didn't have to change the code on each of my individual grid items. So if I'm just going to show an example, what I do is that I just say grid area title or grid area text. So each of these components have been assigned an area. And all my changes at each breakpoint happen on the CSS for the parent container only. So what I did is I know this this is an example of a fairly complicated grid. So that's why the code looks like this. But so what happens is that per breakpoint, the template rows and columns and areas are tweaked. So I changed these three properties, hit, and I can change it once again when I hit a much narrower breakpoint. So I find this really useful for this particular use case, right? So coming back to this more simplified example, you can see that if I want to make, say, banana take up less space, I can change it. So again, if the number of columns don't match up, it's moot. So let's get rid of this one, I think. So that's how it works. So the reason why when I was halfway through this code switching is the whole thing went off is because currently non-rectangular or disconnected regions are not supported. So if you do that, the browser throws it off because it's like invalid. But again, it's one of those in the far future kind of situations. There is discussion around wanting to support Tetris shapes. But I think it's a bit more complicated, so I think the spec authors need some time to work that out. But something that we can look forward to, right? So similar to Flexbox, you can also align items with grid. I've covered most of the properties when I talked about Flexbox. One of the things that I think less people know of is a particular category of alignment properties called the overflow alignment keywords. Because sometimes, especially grid where it's like a two-dimensional thing, there will be situations where the total size of the grid items is larger than the grid container. So let's, for example, like this particular example, there is overflow. But when we set particular alignment properties, so let me highlight this first. And one nice thing to note, recently the Firefox DevTools also tells you if your container is a scrollable container or not here. So that's kind of nice. So in this particular case, if I want to sort of induce data loss, and I say data loss is because sometimes, like for example, if I set the align content value to end, can't spell end either. What happens is that the items are aligned to the end, but I can't scroll to the top. So the text in the first two grid items, it's gone. I can't read it. So this is considered data loss. So what you can do, so there are two keywords, fairly simple, unsafe and safe. So unsafe tells the browser that you can live with data loss. So the browser is gonna, okay, if you want it that way, sure, I'll set it to end and leave it that way. But especially if you have dynamically loaded content, you're not sure if this situation is gonna happen, you can always put a keyword called safe, and if there's any instance of overflow, the browser's gonna switch. It's not gonna set it to align content end per se, and it's gonna assign an alignment property where data loss does not happen. So this actually essentially ends up being align content start. But because you've indicated that you want the browser to prevent data loss, that's what this keyword does. So that's a category of alignment properties that I think not a lot of people know about it yet. And one more thing that Grid Inspector is really useful for is auto sizing. So I think in some of the previous examples, I used this function called repeat. So what repeat does is that it saves you the trouble of repeating a pattern, especially, again, if you have a very complicated grid, or even if just you have a 20-column grid. You don't want to sit there and type like 5M, 5M, 5M 20 times. You can use the repeat function to help do that for you. And with the repeat function, you can either explicitly say how many columns you want, or you can let the browser decide. You can just tell the browser that, OK, I want columns of this size. You generate how many, depending on how much space there is. So these keywords that allow you to do that, there are two of them. They're called autofill or autofit. And they behave very similarly when there is limited space. So if I go here, now it's set to autofill. I change it to autofit, nothing changes. But the moment there is extra space, that's when the distinction happens. So if I pull it out and there's a lot of extra space, let's go back to fill. So what autofill does is that it keeps any empty space when you don't have enough grid items that fill up all that space. So in this particular grid example, no, wrong one. Sorry, go down. Yeah, I have 5 grid items. I'm just going to explain what the code does in English. I have 5 grid items, that's fine. What I want the browser to do with the grid is that I want it to generate as many columns as possible with a minimum width of 6 ems. So clearly, there's enough space for more than 5 items. So when you set a value of autofill, these empty spaces are kept. But if you say, you're like, OK, I only have 5 items. This space is wasted. Let's not do that. Let's let all the items just fill them up. That's when you want to use autofit. So the empty columns get collapsed, and then the space gets filled up. And it took me looking at this in the context of DevTools with the overlay activated before I really understood it. So I find this particularly helpful. And the last thing I want to cover for Grid is this relatively new feature that Firefox started supporting since 66, is the ability to animate grid columns and rows. So previously, you could only do it with Grid. The thing is that this animation has always been written in the spec. It's just that browser vendors, take a bit of time to implement it. But this is supposed to happen in every browser. You just don't know when. And when you see something like this, right, you see my pawn moving across the board. The first time I saw an example of this, I thought, oh, OK, my grid item must be moving across the board. But it turns out that's not how it's done. So with the grid inspector, you can actually see what's happening. There's one grid item in my grid. And my grid is actually made up of 2 columns and 2 rows. So the background is a lie. It's just a gradient, so don't be fooled. But the actual animation happens on the grid cell which my pawn resides in. So what's happening is that it's not that the grid item is moving across different columns and rows. Rather, the row itself is expanding and shrinking, moving the grid item across the container. And I think DevTools makes it really easy to visualize this, as opposed to, because intuitively you wouldn't think that the grid item behaves like this. But if you had wanted to do animation of things across your grid, unfortunately you're going to have to do it this way, because you can't move your grid item across rows and columns, because interpolation can't happen that way. So if you're looking to play around with this new feature of animating rows and columns, this is definitely something to keep in mind, and use the DevTools to kind of help you visualize what exactly is happening. So because of time constraints, I didn't really get a chance to cover things like subgrid, or the fact that the newer sizing units allow for elements to grow and shrink at different rates, because there's a lot of new things we can do with CSS these days. But these new layout techniques do allow designers and developers to spend less time wrangling code and more time to focus your efforts on actually designing more innovative and adaptive layouts that really work well across many different browsers and devices. So I want to end off by saying, if you've been on the fence trying out these new features because they seem complicated and hard, just go for it. Be the cat. You'll surprise yourself. So my time is up. Thank you very much.